Okay, if we take a look at some of the theories about how society is stratified, we can take a look at, both from macro standpoints, the functional and conflict theory explanations about why society is stratified. Once again, we can remember that functionalism is the view that society operates like a living organism, all the different parts working together toward the greater whole, and conflict theory is the idea of groups competing for limited resources and the struggle for authority. So we're going to see that they're going to have very different ideas about why society is stratified. When we take a look at the functionalist point of view, two very famous sociologists, Kingsley Davis and Wilbert Moore, in 1945, came up with a proposal or their theory about why society is stratified. And it follows a couple basic steps. The idea that society has lots of positions that need to be filled, right? That some positions in society are more important than others, that more qualified people have to fulfill those more important positions. And then the last idea is that in order to properly motivate people to fill those important positions, society is going to offer more reward. And they specifically refer to Weber's idea of the 3 Ps. So to kind of run through it, you can kind of come up with some examples on your own. I'll give at least one example, clear example here. So society has lots of different positions to fill. There's different types of jobs. There's everything from janitors to doctors in a society. And we would say that some positions are more important than others. And we could say, what's an important position in society? And you might use the example I just gave, doctors. So we'd say, why is a doctor an important position? Well, a doctor prevents disease and keeps people alive and performs an important function in society as far as keeping society going. We would say that an important position like a doctor has to be fulfilled by very qualified people. In other words, in our society, we just don't let anybody walk around saying they're a doctor. So a person has to go to college for a long time and then go to medical school and then fulfill a residency and perhaps an internship, all those other kind of things. So they have to do all these very important things in order to become qualified to fill this very important position. And then the final thing that Davis and Moore said is, and that means that society then gives more reward to those people who go through those quote unquote jump through the hoops. So doctors then receive a lot more property, power, and prestige in society as a reward for fulfilling these very important positions. And we can clearly see why that's a functionalist explanation. Okay? It basically says that within society, everybody's working together to form a whole. And you could actually then say, okay, what's a less important position, and say something like, a waiter or a busboy, and say, okay, well, those positions don't require a lot of, because they're not important, they don't require a lot of clarification or qualification to do it. Basically, anyone can do it, so we're not going to offer as much reward for those jobs. And again, according to Davis and Moore, a very functional view about why society is stratified. And of course, for everybody who comes up with an idea, there's usually somebody waiting on the sidelines to critique it. And sociologist Melvin Tooman in 1953 criticized Davis and Moore in what was then called Tooman's critique. And some of the points that he made about Davis and Moore's theory was a couple different points. One, that there's no way of determining just by definition itself what is an important job in society. So when I said, what's an important job in society? And we said doctor, and it seemed pretty easy to justify why a doctor is an important job. But Tooman would probably go along and say a doctor's job is to prevent disease, and a garbage man's job is to prevent disease. And if you were to say what would happen in society if there were no garbage men, or what happens when garbage men decide to, if any of you ever lived in a city or a town in which there was maybe a garbage strike, you know that conditions can get pretty, first of all, disgusting pretty quickly, and then actually become unhealthy. And that if garbage men weren't taking away trash every single week, as they do or want to do on the schedule, then we would experience an upsurge in disease. So you could say that, in a sense, garbage men, or garbage people, are providing the exact same services doctors do. So why is a doctor a more important job than a garbage person? Tuman also basically said society is not what the term he used was a meritocracy. The idea that within a society, if a society is a meritocracy, everybody in society is rewarded for their basically natural gifts and talents, or at least the talents and gifts that they acquire throughout the course of their lifetime. So in other words, if you're naturally gifted, intelligent, bright, fast at solving problems, or you gain, that automatically means you're going to be rewarded for that. Okay, so people in society are rewarded for their merit or their worth. Clearly, and I'm sure many of you have felt this way, as I have in the past, we sometimes say, I'm not being rewarded in society for what I consider to be either my natural gifts or the things that I've acquired throughout time, the skills I have, that I'm not being rewarded at the level I feel I should be. And the last thing that Tuman basically says is that if society were truly following this functional model that Davis and Moore had, that the majority of people in society would be content or happy. And we know by, if we just, again, explore our own situations or lives, or those of the people we know, that the vast majority of people in society probably don't feel happy or content. Some, again, those of us who feel like, or have felt, I don't feel that way now, but certainly at times in my life I can say, felt like I'm doing a job that I'm overqualified for, or feel like I'm just doing it because that's the only job I can get right now and I'm due for better things. Or many of you are in college because you want to better your situation, because and what Tuman would say is that striving, if we all, sometimes again use that example, if anyone's ever taken those high school aptitude tests, those career aptitude tests, maybe you took it sometime in high school or even early college, and if anybody gets, let's say, garbage man, the reaction usually isn't, yes, that's exactly what I wanted. I was hoping to get garbage man. Man, that's that job for me, and I'm going to be happy and content with that the rest of my life. So again, those are the critiques that Tuman puts out toward Davis and Moore. We can take a look at the conflict theory point of view. Again, social theorist Gaetano Mosca basically broke it down kind of in a three-step way to explain why society is stratified from a conflict theory point of view. The easiest way, I said 3 steps. Basically, society requires organization and leadership. Okay, so society is so big and so complex that there, quote unquote, has to be organization of it, and that there have to be people, and we've discussed some of the characteristics of leaders, but we just basically used the definition, people who influence other people's behaviors or opinions. So there has to be leaders in society. Second point, that leadership and organization requires inequalities of power. So in other words, a leadership has to have some type of authority or ability to get people to do what he or she wants. So it's no good being a leader if nobody listens to you. So there has to be something to back it up. So there has to be some inequality of power that lets a leader say, I want you to do this, and that the other person feels compelled, in at least some ways, to listen. Whether or not, like we said, that's the gain of a reward or the avoidance of a consequence. But there has to be this inequality of power for leadership to be effective. And then, again, Mosca says that those in power, with that excess of power in society, and remember, conflict theory is about the competition for resources. So if I were to go into a crowded classroom with, let's say, 1 pizza for 20 students or more, and then say, okay, you have to divide this up evenly, and recognize that hardly anybody's going to get any of the pizza. But then I take it a step farther and say, I'm going to put 2 of you in charge of the pizza, and then leave the room and say, okay, 2 of you are in charge of making sure that everybody gets pizza. Again, according to Mosca and according to most conflict theorists, the 2 people in charge are probably going to end up with as much pizza as they want to, and everybody else gets what they decide to give out. So those people in power, the third part to Mosca's argument is, those people in power will seize more resources for themselves in this competition for limited resources. So again, society requires leadership, leadership requires inequalities of power, those people in power will seize more for themselves. So it's a very kind of, like I said, simplified way of explaining why society is divided up. Marx, again, deserves to be mentioned again here, again, from opposing generally a functionalist point of view. Some of the things that Marx definitely talked about in some of his theories that lends to this, some of his writings, were the idea that Marx definitely criticized the idea that, again, what he appeared to take it from the functional point of view, is that those in society or those in power are there because of some type of, like we said, merit or just natural superior traits. That in a functional society, those people at the top are there because they're somehow more qualified or better, and Marx absolutely refutes that and says, you know, many of the people in power in a society are not inherently better or superior in any ways to those people. It's just this inequality of power that's resulted in that. So this last point I wanted to make up here, again, another theorist by the name of Lenski, basically in the 1960s, tried to decide whether or not there was a way of kind of assimilating both functionalism and conflict theory, theories of stratification, into what became known as Lenski's synthesis. That idea of, is there a way of explaining society from both a functional and a conflict theory point of view? And what Lenski came up with is that earlier types of societies, especially some of the ones we already mentioned when we talked about societal transformation, hunter-gatherer societies, other what we might call simpler or more primitive types of societies, absolutely function in what functionalists describe as the way society works. So if you look at a hunter-gatherer society, it is very much a meritocracy. We think about, again, a lot of Native American Plains Indians or Native American societies or tribes that existed prior to Western expansion. We look at those societies and recognize that they did operate very much as a meritocracy. Who was the chief? Not necessarily the person who inherited it or did it because they had the most, but were the people who were probably the wisest, the people who did the best job of guiding people or had the most wisdom. The people who were the greatest hunters were those people who demonstrated those skills. So in hunter-gatherer or sometimes more simple societies, meritocracy is absolutely a way of determining who is at the higher ends of society. People were rewarded much more for their talents and gifts than in other societies. And basically, as society gets more complex and produces surplus, surplus begins to accumulate, and suddenly who's in society is based more on the amount of wealth that they inherited from those people who came before them. So in other words, the status you're born into replaces personal merit as a way of determining social stratification. So again, what Lenski did was take a functionalist point of view and a conflict theory point of view and blend them together into an explanation of not only how a society is stratified, but perhaps how stratification changes as societies transform.